In the middle of the workweek, on May 28, 2008, Mora Jones, a 40-year-old woman, planned to spend the night at the home of her beloved man, Paul Thompson. She came to his place after work, bringing along a bag with overnight essentials and a change of clothes. However, in the evening, a disagreement arose between the lovers. After the quarrel, Mora decided that it would be better to return to her own home and spend the night in her own apartment. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, she left Paul's house but never made it back to her dwelling that night. Mora lived alone in her apartment in the city of Glasgow, Scotland. Her windows offered a stunning view of the park. She had moved here from London in 2003 when she got a new job. Mora held the position of a manager in a company that produced non-alcoholic beverages. She really enjoyed living and working in Glasgow, as the city was famous for its picturesque parks and wonderful places for outdoor recreation. Since moving there, she had made many new friends. Mora was fond of Glasgow residents for their warm and friendly nature and sense of humor. For 4 years now, Mora had been dating a man named Paul Thompson. Their relationship was very serious, and she was even contemplating marriage. But suddenly, the woman vanished without a trace. Late in the evening, she left Paul's apartment, taking her things, and headed to her own place. However, in the morning, when her fiancé tried to call her, she didn't answer the phone. This greatly alarmed him. He began to search for his beloved. Meanwhile, in the morning, park workers discovered the body of a woman lying in the bushes in the middle of Glasgow's Royal Park. They immediately reported the horrifying find to the police. Law enforcement officers who arrived at the crime scene thoroughly examined everything around. The deceased was lying face down, her body naked from the waist down. She had a torn jacket and bra on, but they remained on the body. The victim's pants were lying underneath her. Nearby lay a woman's purse, in which documents in the name of Mora Jones were found. This allowed the police to quickly establish the identity of the deceased. The officers went to Mora's building, which was located not far from the park. The woman died before managing to cover some 100 meters to her own home. Her car was parked nearby. The police wanted to involve Mora's loved ones in identifying the body, but no one was home, and no one answered the door. Investigators tracked down the relatives of the deceased, who lived in the town of Weston. They were Steve and Archer. Detectives contacted them and invited them to identify the body. Mora's parents got in the car and drove to Glasgow. Their daughter's face was so disfigured that, in order not to shock the relatives too much, it was decided to show it to them via a TV screen. They confirmed that it was indeed Mora who had become the victim of the crime. The grief-stricken parents informed their daughter's brother about her death, and he urgently flew in from Australia for the funeral. While forensic experts worked diligently at the crime scene, no clues were found. Near Mora's car, pieces of a strap from her purse and a cosmetic bag were discovered. Investigators assumed that the woman was attacked when she was near the vehicle and then dragged into the park, where the crime was committed. They seized recordings from the park's surveillance cameras and began to thoroughly study them. In addition, law enforcement officers started looking for possible witnesses to the attack. The body of the deceased was sent for an autopsy. The forensic medical examiner established that the woman was brutally beaten and before dying. DNA, left during the attack, was extracted from her body. The sample was sent to the laboratory for analysis. The obtained results were compared with the database, but no matches were found. The first suspect in this case was Mora's fiancé, Paul Thompson, as he was the last one to see her alive on that fatal night. He was summoned to the police station for questioning. It turned out that Paul had no alibi. The man said that after the argument, Mora left, and he, offended, stayed at home and went to bed without even trying to catch up with her. Waking up in the morning, Paul realized that he had acted incorrectly. He tried to call his beloved to apologize and arrange a meeting, but she did not answer the phone. Then the man went first to Mora's home and then to her work, but he could not find her anywhere. Later, he learned the terrible news about his fiancée's murder. Paul's DNA sample was taken and sent for testing. The results showed that his genetic material did not match the DNA. Thus, the man was excluded from the circle of suspects. Investigators believed that the main motive for Mora's murder was probably, the woman accidentally crossed paths with a maniac who was hunting for victims that night. After attacking Mora and committing his crime, he killed her to get rid of an unwanted witness. Detectives compiled a list of all offenders registered in Glasgow. The list contained 22 names. Investigators began to check them. They conducted interviews with each of them, took DNA samples, and examined their alibis. Many of the suspects had confirmed alibis. The results of DNA tests showed that none of those on the list was involved in the crime. Then the circle of suspects was expanded. The police began to check all criminals who lived in the area and had ever committed offenses. But this also yielded no results. Next, law enforcement officers started working through all suspicious individuals spotted in the area, the homeless, alcoholics, and troubled teenagers. But this did not bring any benefit either. Recordings from the park's surveillance cameras also provided no clues. None of the cameras covered the crime scene. However, the police were lucky to obtain recordings from surveillance cameras on buses that passed by the park during the time period when the murder occurred. Detectives began to carefully study this video footage. Thoroughly examining the recordings from the surveillance cameras, investigators noticed how Mora Jones enters the park accompanied by an unknown man in the middle of the night. However, the woman never came out of the park. Instead, sometime later, the same mysterious man of athletic build appeared on the footage, leaving the park alone. The stranger exited the park near the Baptist church at 2:15 a.m. He immediately drew the attention of detectives and became the main suspect in the murder. Law enforcement officers continued to meticulously study the video recordings, hoping to find at least some clues that could lead them to the criminal's trail. While one group of investigators was reviewing the surveillance footage, other law enforcement officers went to interview residents of the buildings adjacent to the park. Most of those interviewed stated that they had not heard or seen anything suspicious that night. One of the residents said that around midnight, she heard a loud female scream that suddenly stopped. Two other couples who were walking in the park also heard some screams. And one of the taxi drivers even said to his partner upon hearing a bone-chilling shriek, "If a murder was committed here tonight, we just witnessed it." Despite the late hour, the street was still quite busy, but none of the witnesses who heard the scream called the police or rushed to help Mora. Eventually, the police got lucky when Lucy Pektlova, a woman of Czech origin, opened the door for them. She told the investigators some interesting details. According to Lucy, Marik Harker, whom she had sheltered out of pity, lived with her in the apartment. Marik was a 33-year-old former soldier from Slovakia, of strong build, and was fond of kickboxing. He and Lucy had met a year ago when they worked together in Liverpool, and then their paths diverged. When Marik showed up in Glasgow again on May 18, 2008, he had nowhere to stay, so he remembered Lucy. Being kind and accommodating, she allowed him to live with her while he looked for a job. However, Marik did not even try to find employment. Instead, he constantly drank, behaved indecently, and watched porn films all the time. Such behavior frightened Lucy, and she wanted to get rid of the unwanted guest as soon as possible. But the woman was afraid to kick him out. On the eve of Mora's murder, Marik got very drunk and behaved inadequately. Around 10 in the evening, he left Lucy's house, stating that he was going to look for prostitutes. He returned at 3:15 a.m. By that time, Lucy was already asleep, so she did not see the condition her tenant was in, she only heard him opening the door. In the morning, Marik seemed completely different, as if something had happened. The man was frightened, hastily gathered his things, and fled the apartment without saying a word to Lucy. He never returned. In his haste, Marik left some of his belongings behind. When Lucy learned about the tragedy in the park, she immediately suspected her lodger and shared her suspicions with the police. Investigators found out that Marik had bought a ticket for the first available flight and flown to the Czech Republic, from where he took a bus to Slovakia. After that, his trail was lost. While examining the things Marik had left in Lucy's apartment, the police found blood stains on his leather jacket. They seized the suspect's belongings, including his toothbrush, and sent them along with the jacket for DNA analysis. The results showed that Marik's genetic material matched the samples taken from the victim's body, and the blood on the jacket belonged to Mora. Moreover, among the suspect's belongings, the murdered woman's personal items were found, her broken phone and camera. It seemed that Marik had taken them with him while fleeing the crime scene. Based on the collected evidence, an arrest warrant was issued for Marik Harker. The police managed to track down his whereabouts. On June 18, 2008, Marik was arrested while hiding in a house in a northern village of Slovakia. The suspect was extradited to Great Britain. He was charged with murder and robbery. However, Marik denied his guilt on all counts. The trial in Marik Harker's case began on March 12, 2009, in the city of Glasgow. The defendant never pleaded guilty to the crimes he was charged with. During the court hearing, the prosecutor noted that Marik had arrived in the United Kingdom back in 2007 and had managed to work in Liverpool. And 10 days before the tragic events, he appeared in Glasgow and stayed with an acquaintance. All this time, the defendant behaved inappropriately. He drank a lot and was consumed by lust. On that fatal night, Marik went to the park with the intention of finding prostitutes and fulfilling his perverted fantasies with them. But apparently, there were no hookers to be found that night. So Marik left the park by another route, weaving between the buildings. At the ill-fated hour of around 11:30 p.m., Mora Jones got out of her car near the park, heading home with a large black suitcase. Marik had completely different plans for her. The man attacked Mora with the intention of robbing her. The criminal forced the victim to go with him to the park. This moment was captured by a surveillance camera. Marik was much taller and more heavily built than the slender Mora, so she had no chance of resisting. The attacker's size and clothing fully matched Marik's description. The prosecution claimed that, having dragged Mora into the park, Marik brutally beat and also stole some of the victim's belongings. At 2:15 a.m., the criminal left the park. According to Lucy, who had provided shelter to Marik, the man returned home only at 3:15 a.m. In the morning, he behaved unusually. Sober and frightened, Marik hastily gathered his things and fled, leaving some of his belongings behind. It was these items he left that allowed a DNA examination to be conducted, which proved his involvement in Mora's murder. The autopsy results indicated that Mora died at approximately 2 a.m. That is, after the attack, the unfortunate woman lived for about 2 more hours. If someone from the people present in the park, upon hearing the victim's screams, had called for help, her life could still have been saved. Unfortunately, no one did that. None of the witnesses considered it necessary to help the woman who was being killed. This news about the shocking human indifference and callousness became a real shock for Mora's family. The deceased woman died a horrific and excruciating death. Experts counted at least 65 injuries on her body, although the exact number could not be established. The killer mercilessly pummeled his victim with his hands and feet all over her body. He literally beat Mora to death and left her to die in terrible agony. The face of the deceased was mutilated beyond recognition, a broken nose, split lip, knocked out teeth, all covered in bruises. It's no wonder it was so hard for her parents to identify her. The criminal behaved like a mad beast who maimed and disfigured a beautiful and successful woman. Mora had severe head injuries, fractures of the right cheekbone and larynx, and broken ribs. Her entire body was covered with huge bruises. In the forensic expert's opinion, death occurred as a result of injuries to the head and neck. During his testimony in court, he noted that small hemorrhages in the victim's eyes indicated that she had been strangled. Characteristic bruises on the back of her hands and forearms testified to desperate attempts to defend herself. Mora fought for her life with her tormentor with her last ounce of strength. However, she had almost no chance of withstanding the inhuman monster. The forensic expert noted that the killer did not use any weapons. An experienced kickboxer, Marik dealt with the defenseless victim using only his fists and feet. The prosecutors provided the court with convincing evidence of the defendant's guilt. The genetic material of the extracted from Mora's body fully matched Marik's DNA. The blood on his jacket also belonged to the deceased. Items belonging to the victim of the crime were found in the suspect's dwelling. The prosecutor petitioned for the most severe punishment deserved for this brutal, bestial murder. The defense insisted that the police had grabbed the wrong person. According to Marik, he was not in the park at all that night, he was allegedly sleeping at home. The lawyer even proposed an alternative version of events. Allegedly, 3 people were involved in the murder, 2 brothers by the surname of Karim, who attacked Mora in the park to steal her credit cards, and a certain Jason Malherin, whom the brothers later named as the real killer. This Malherin had a conviction for a crime, and one of the episodes of his criminal activity resembled the attack on Mora, although that time the victim was not killed. Jason lived near Mora's house and had no alibi at the time of her murder. According to the defense, the man allegedly confessed to the murder to his ex-girlfriend, saying it was he who finished off the woman in the park. Upon learning about this chilling confession, the ex-girlfriend reported it to the police. However, as it turned out, law enforcement officers thoroughly checked this information. Jason Malherin's DNA did not match the traces at the crime scene. The suspect himself denied any involvement in Mora's murder and insisted that he had not confessed to anything to his ex-girlfriend. It seemed that this was a false lead that the defense lawyer had latched onto in order to divert suspicion from his client. Later, the Karim brothers confessed that on the night in question, they had indeed broken into Mora's car and stolen her credit cards, but they had not seen the woman and had not touched her. They made up the story about Malherin the killer to save their own skin. The lawyer tried to persuade the jury to acquit Marik Harker and urged them to be skeptical of the evidence provided by the prosecution, claiming that the conclusions of the DNA examination could only indicate the involvement of a particular person in the crime with high probability but not with certainty. In the defense counsel's opinion, the results of the DNA analysis should be considered only as one piece of evidence among others. These attempts by the lawyer to sow distrust in genetic expertise aroused indignation among the other participants in the process. The prosecutor retorted, "The probability that the biological material from the crime scene belongs to someone other than the defendant is equal to 1 chance in a billion, so this assumption is not even worth discussing." The court took into account that in his homeland, Marik already had 13 convictions, 4 of which were for actions. He had spent many years behind bars. People who knew him in Slovakia characterized him as a cruel, aggressive, and prone guy. Lucy, who had imprudently let him into her home, was extremely lucky that she did not share the fate of her compatriot Mora. The system that allowed a dangerous repeat offender to enter Great Britain should be blamed. The trial lasted 20 days. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Marik Harker was found guilty on all counts. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 25 years. Addressing the convicted man, he noted, "By your actions that night, you displayed an extraordinary, unheard-of cruelty." As Marik was being led out of the courtroom, the crowd greeted him with shouts of "Beast, Savage, Executioner." The horrific story of Mora Jones's death shook the entire British public. Many were outraged at how it was possible for a foreign recidivist to easily cross the border, end up on the streets of a peaceful city, and become a deadly threat to local residents. After the verdict was announced, Harker was entered into the British Register of Offenders, and it was decided that after serving his sentence, he would be deported to his homeland. However, already in November 2016, Marik was extradited to Slovakia, where he will serve the remainder of his sentence. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.